you so much. I'd like everyone to just join me in thanking all 4 of our speakers again. Speakers will join me at this front, and we'll take questions from the audience. Okay, I'm going to let everyone get situated for just another second here, and then I think I see a question right here.
Yes, I'm a volunteer gardener with the Central Park Conservancy in 36B, zone 36, which happens to be the location of 2 of the Randell monuments. So I'm fascinated by the monuments, in part because for years I was one of those people walking over, particularly one at 103rd and 6th, raking and weeding and watering the gardener, his own gardener, mowing over. He probably was the one who broke off the chip. I'm so fascinated by it now, I should look at those maps because I look for them everywhere. And I think I may have found one at the corner of Cabrini and Fort Washington, but I don't know if the grid went up that far. That's aside.
He gridded that whole island.
It is.
Yeah, the 1811 plan only called for development to 155th, but he gridded the entire island, and you can see it all. You can see all those maps. If
So
you
it's
go
possible
to the
that is one.
yeah.
I guess my question is, I'm fascinated by it. I'm sure a lot of other people are fascinated by it. But we sort of downplay it. As somebody who works in that area, as a tour guide, we were sort of told that, we're concerned about vandalism, we're concerned about the theft maybe, we're concerned about the integrity of the artifact itself. But if there's a way that we could showcase it, talk about it, allow people to know that it's there, I wonder if the Conservancy had rethought what we're...
Yeah, I mean, we're still thinking about it. I think, as I was presenting sort of this more comprehensive idea of what pre-park history is with the Randall Monument, Seneca Village, the fort landscape, there's further research to be done about the reservoir. I think, and other elements of pre-park history, I think there's a desire to have a more comprehensive approach to thinking about it, as opposed to just, we put up some signs in the fort landscape, and that was kind of one effort, and then we are working on Seneca Village stuff a little bit, so maybe we can do that next. But instead, maybe thinking about it more comprehensively and as part of a larger plan of park interpretation. So not just focusing on pre-park history, but how do we interpret all of the layers of the park's history? And frankly, it's a pretty daunting task, and I think we're often kind of stymied by it on some level because it feels a little bit overwhelming, and but it's certainly something that we're thinking about currently, and I think I really want to just personally put a sign up by one of the Randall monuments because I think there is so much interest, but I think we need to think about it more comprehensively and not just as these individual efforts.
I was just interested in taking it back a few steps. Was there any interest on Volk's and Homestead's part to interpret the park itself, to interpret the park in any sense the way we're interpreting it now, by signage and tours and...
Yeah, I mean, I know there were, I think there's other people in the audience who could probably speak to this a little better, but there were park keepers, and so they were stationed, I think, at, I don't know if they were at every single entrance, but they had little booths, and they were there to kind of give people directions and information. I didn't really talk about this in my presentation, but the fort landscape was actually a place that they actually preserved the ruins of the fortifications that were still there and wanted people to experience them, and so there was an interest actually in that history up north. I'm trying to think of other examples. Oh yeah, there was a museum up at Mount St. Vincent in the northern part of the park. They used that building to have a museum, and so they had exhibits. There was also a museum in the Arsenal building. So I think there were these efforts. I don't think, again, they were very comprehensive, and I don't think they had, tours and things that we have today. But I think there was efforts to get people to navigate the park in a safe way and to lead people to places that were destinations that they wanted people to visit. So, but it is an interesting thing that I think deserves further research.
I have a question I wanted to pose to everyone. I found it really interesting as someone who, I work in a museum context, often museum conservators can be very object-focused, single object focused, thinking about the stories that objects tell. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how conflicts may arise when we look from sort of across scales, from objects to contexts to landscapes to histories. What is the object of preservation, how that changes for different professionals with different approaches. I think certainly hearing an archaeologist speak, I've heard the context really coming to the fore, whereas I think the landscape architecture approach is more seeing a living landscape. I think this must pose some sort of complex of values. Richard, do you want to?
I was ask you a question. I mean, and I'm curious about your totems. I was thinking there must be a connection here between stone monuments and totems, how you treat them. But as an archaeologist, I mean, the context is I think Nan would agree with, it is absolutely prime. And the thought of digging up any one of these monuments or taking out any one of the vaults, I mean, that would be sacrilege. You know, from an archaeological standpoint, because you are losing its position in the landscape. You have a couple in the museum, and in the Historical Society you certainly don't need any more. Maybe that's not the reaction you would want to get as an art historian, but to me as an archaeologist, you want to see these things out in their natural habitat, natural cultural habitat, and leave them there.
I think you have to pay attention to both. I mean, you can't focus on just, leaving everything in the ground. And when you take it out, of course, you have to take care of it. But you have to, as an archaeologist, you have to link it all the time to the context that it comes from, because otherwise it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Right.
Maybe this brings up the prospect of using the digital as a way to increase access, because I've had the very great privilege of holding some of those Seneca Village materials in my hand, and in fact mending the teapot you showed on the screen. I've had a really personal, emotional experience with those artifacts connecting me with the history, and I think that's a real privilege that conservators have that not all of the general public could have. So maybe we can think about the role of perhaps the digital archaeological repository and more digital sharing as a way forward in this.
I also think the Randall monuments pose a really interesting challenge to that question, because to me I think they derive their power by the fact of them being in the location that they're in. And once you take them out of that context, even thinking of context archaeologically but also historically, like how much meaning do they have in the museum context? Even though you can study their stone more, you can see the letters that are the numbers that are on the top, but really their power is kind of from them still being, or at least to me, from them still being in their original location.
Can you see Aaron in the back?
Yeah, thanks everybody. I like the palimpsest metaphor. It sort of conveys the stratigraphic kind of layering of the landscape itself, but it also strikes me that there's a kind of Russian doll metaphor here too, that if we see the park as itself an artifact and not only as a landscape, and we have artifacts within artifacts within artifacts, and you have to compromise the outer one in order to get to the inner one, and which may also speak to the kind of potential for reversibility. You can reassemble the Russian doll after you take it apart. But I want to ask a question, I guess this is for Nan, about a different scale of relationship. So we talked a lot about the individual intentions of the designers of the park and about the needs of the masses today. And I was intrigued by your comments about potential engagements with the descendant community of Seneca Village, which would be somewhere in between at a sort of human scale from the individual makers and masses of urban dwellers and visitors. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what conversations you may have had, how you identified people, and what the range of their own feelings toward the excavations and the potential to recuperate this history.
I have to say, you've touched on something that is very problematic for us, because when Cynthia Copeland did the original show at the New York Historical Society, which was called The Life and Death of Seneca Village. And at the end of the show, I don't know if any of you saw it, there was a list of all the known occupants of Seneca Village, and it was asked if anybody attending the show was related to anybody from Seneca Village. So when I talk about the descendant community, I'm really speaking metaphorically,
Okay.
because we don't have any descendants, which is staggering to me. I mean, here we have all these people living in New York who have African American background, and nobody seems to have an ancestor that came from Seneca Village. I personally think it's because the landscape was destroyed and the community disbanded. You know, so we know where some of them went, but they didn't move as a community. And so we don't, I mean, but theoretically it is the descendant community, however that constitutes itself to make decisions about how Seneca Village should be represented, I think.
Do you not think as research progresses that these people are going to emerge? I would think there's
You
quite
know,
a strong chance that they
there's
will.
been a lot of recognition of the Seneca Village project when it was going on. There was a lot of publicity, not during it, but at the end of it. And I mean, every once in a while, there's somebody who has said they
Hey,
were,
just
but we
the-
found
one
out
of
that they weren't.
The genealogical trees are just proliferating
You
all over the
think
place.
about how Georgetown
Mhm.
tracked down the descendants of the slaves that
Yes,
they
it's
sold.
true.
You think if there was investment in the genealogical research?
We've done a fair amount of genealogical research, but maybe we have to do more. We've thought of putting ads in papers around the country, trying to get descendants, anybody who had any sort of idea. I'm happy to take any ideas that people have about how to do this research and pass them on to Cynthia
One more
and
question
Diana.
from Peter.
So, fascinating. Trying to think about the presentations tonight and Park maybe in general as a kind of lens through which we can look with greater magnification and light on conservation. So one of the words that's often used when talking about objects and object conservation is aura. Right? We didn't talk about aura tonight with Central Park. And I'm wondering if we could think about that question of aura in order to understand or to ask the question to any of you, how we might be able to rethink principles of understanding object conservation by thinking about the various ways, for instance, the ways Professor Bowen showed the different treatments of Central Park over time. Maybe Central Park could help us acquire a more varied vocabulary for thinking about objects conservation.
I think that's so. It's such a complex environment. You know, it's partially a museum. It's so many different things. I think different elements in it do require different strategies. Perhaps it's appropriate with something as small as a boat landing to go back to an original architectural design. But that would be an inappropriate strategy for the entire, the treescape, let's say. So I do think adapting the strategy for the object of investigation and its impact on visitors is reasonable.
I agree. I think that part of what we've tried to do at the Conservancy is have some kind of overarching way of thinking about the park. And I think what I was trying to kind of show is this idea of thinking about the landscape as a comprehensive work of art and design, and looking at the objects in relation to this comprehensive work of art and design. And I do think that what maybe guides us more than adherence to the original design is really an adherence to the original design intent, which is to create this place that's a retreat from the city and a place for people to go to experience nature and to be together in a social way, and to play baseball and to do all the things that people do in the park. But I think we have to kind of, adhere to that original design intent. And I think the park still reflects, the way the park is used, even though there are a lot of modern uses, I think still ultimately reflects that original design intent. So that's the kind of, approach that we take at the Conservancy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring the question and answer to a close and invite all of our guests here to please stay after and ask any additional questions you may have. And I want to just ask everyone to do one more round of applause for our speakers.